All right, let's talk about cannabis. Today, we're going to cut through all the noise and all the hype and get right to the science. We're going to look at what the evidence actually says about how this plant interacts with your brain and your body.
So what is it really? I mean, you ask 10 different people, you get 10 different answers. For some, it's a totally natural remedy. For others, it's just a way to unwind. And for a lot of people, it's a source of some pretty serious health concerns. This confusion is exactly why we need to dig into the biology of what's going on.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the absolute basics, then get into the really surprising stuff, like the system your brain already has for cannabis. From there, we'll see how the plant hijacks that system, we'll explore some of its most famous effects, and then we'll wrap up with the most critical, science-backed risks that you really need to know about.
Okay, let's start by clearing the air and just defining some of the most common terms you're going to hear. You gotta know these before we can get into the really cool science.
First up, the two big players, sativa and indica. You've probably heard of these. Sativa is the one people usually link with that energetic, head high. Indica, on the other hand, that's the one known for full-body relaxation. The easy way to remember it, indica will have you in the couch.
Now, for the chemicals inside the plant, this is what really matters. THC, that's the main event, the compound that creates the classic high. It's the psychoactive part. Then you have CBD. Think of it as THC's non-psychoactive cousin. It doesn't get you high, but it's often used for things like pain or anxiety. And believe me, the ratio of these two makes all the difference.
All right, now we get to the most fascinating part of this whole story. Why does cannabis even affect us in the first place? Well, the answer isn't really in the plant, it's inside you. This is the absolute key. As neurobiologist Andrew Huberman puts it, our bodies were basically built for this. We have a system that was receptive to cannabis long before we ever knew the plant existed. Your brain is literally pre-wired with special docking stations or receptors for these kinds of compounds.
So get this, your body makes its own cannabis-like molecules. They're called endogenous cannabinoids, which literally means cannabis from within. These little chemicals like anandamide and 2-AG are always working behind the scenes, fine-tuning everything from your mood and appetite to your memory. They're a huge part of how your nervous system stays in balance.
So how do they actually work? What's kind of weird. Most signals in your brain go one way, right? From neuron A to neuron B. But these are different. After neuron B gets a signal, it releases one of these cannabinoids that travels backwards to neuron A. And what's it doing? It's basically telling the first neuron to, hey, chill out a little. It's a beautiful, subtle feedback loop that stops our brain's communication from going haywire.
Okay, so if we have this super delicate, precise system already built in, what happens when you introduce cannabis from the outside world? Well, it's not a gentle conversation. It's more like a hostile takeover. Huberman has the perfect analogy for this. He says your body's natural cannabinoids are like a little cap gun, a small pop that sends a subtle signal. THC from cannabis, though, that's like a howitzer cannon blasting the exact same target.
And here's the bottom line. THC from a plant binds to your receptors with thousands, literally thousands, of times more power than your body's own molecules. It just completely overwhelms and bullies your natural system, flooding those delicate feedback loops with way more force than they were ever designed to handle. So, let's look at what that howitzer effect actually does. How does it create some of the most famous and, frankly, misunderstood effects of cannabis? Let's start with creativity.
So does cannabis actually make you more creative? The science says it's complicated. It doesn't just flip some magical creativity switch in your brain. What it seems to do, for some people, is lower anxiety and dial up a personality trait called openness to experience. This just makes you more willing to explore weird ideas, what we call divergent thinking. But, and this is a huge but, if cannabis makes you anxious instead of relaxed, it can totally shut that process down. It really depends on the person.
Okay, what about as an aphrodisiac? Super interesting stuff here. An fMRI study looked at this and found it only works for some people. Check out the chart. Group A saw a huge spike of activity in the brain's reward center when they saw erotic images. Group non-A, the opposite. The big difference was that the group that wasn't aroused had a spike in the hormone prolactin after using cannabis, which is known to just tank your sex drive.
Now, here's one effect that is pretty much undisputed. Cannabis almost always messes with your short-term memory. You know that classic, wait, what was I just saying moment? That's totally real. And it happens because THC puts the brakes on activity in the hippocampus, which is the main hub in your brain for making new memories. So far, we've talked about how it works and some of its subjective effects. But now we have to shift gears and talk about the most serious evidence-based health risks. And this is especially important when we're talking about vulnerable populations.
This statistic is, honestly, it's terrifying. 15% of pregnant mothers in the U.S. report using cannabis. Why is that so dangerous? Well, remember those cannabinoid receptors we talked about? They are absolutely critical for wiring a baby's brain correctly in the womb. Firing a chemical howitzer like THC at that delicate process is an unbelievably high-stakes gamble.
And that crucial window for brain development doesn't just snapshot at birth, not even close. Your brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning, decision-making, your whole personality, it's basically under construction until you're about 25.
So when an adolescent uses cannabis regularly, it's hijacking that final phase of construction. Studies show it actually speeds up the natural thinning of that all-important prefrontal cortex. And the more cannabis they use, the more extreme that thinning becomes. This has been tied to some severe long-term problems, including making people 4 times more likely to develop major depression.
But the most alarming risk might be for psychosis. A huge 2022 review in the top-tier journal Lancet Psychiatry found that heavy cannabis use during the teen years quadruples the risk of developing a disorder like schizophrenia later in life. That risk is especially high for people who already have a genetic predisposition.
And this risk is actually getting worse over time. Why? Because the risk of psychosis is directly linked to how potent the THC is. And as growers keep breeding stronger and stronger strains, the products out there today are way, way more potent than they were a few decades ago. And that just ramps up the danger.
So we end up right back where we started, but now with a much clearer picture. The science doesn't give us easy black and white answers, but it does give us the facts. Cannabis isn't just some harmless plant. It's a powerful chemical that hijacks a really fundamental system in our brains. And the question it leaves us with is a heavy one. Knowing these profound biological effects, especially on a developing brain, how do we balance personal choice with public health? It's definitely something we're thinking about.